Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to do an interesting video. I wanted to talk about a lot of what we have been seeing with the Overwatch League teams and whether or not their season can be considered a success. Now I'm not going to run through every single team and say whether or not their season was a success or not. I just kind of want to talk about a broad sense and in general what determines if the season was in fact a success, because I think you have different expectations for a lot of different teams, and I'll give some examples for some teams who I think you have to look at in different ways, because I think if you just look at the record and how they performed overall in the season, I don't think that necessarily tells you everything you need to know. So I think success is obviously a super hard thing to gauge, and it's super subjective. It's not an objective thing. It never has been an objective thing. It's always been something that you have to kind of pick up yourself and you have to determine on your own. You can't really say, this team was successful or this team was not successful just by putting it into a metric and say, okay, this team isn't successful because they finished at this point in the bracket or this point in the standings. It doesn't work that way. Success is obviously, it's internal. Look, at the end of the day, every team is going to sit back and say this season wasn't a success unless they won the grand finals, right? Vancouver and San Francisco are the only two teams who can realistically say right now that their season could be successful. A lot of your teams may not look at their season as successful. They may be happy with the way they performed, but they didn't win the grand finals, and that's every team's goal at the end of the day. So there's going to be a lot of teams who say we didn't succeed because we didn't make it into the playoffs, we didn't make the grand finals, or whatever it may be. But I think you have to really look at your team kind of broadly. Where did you finish? How strong were you when the season ended? And how confident are you going into the 2020 season in your team as it is currently? I think that is the biggest key to gauging success. Can you look at your team as it is at the end of the season, and can you say, you know what? I think we, going forward, are in a good position. I'm not worried about where we are right now as a team. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean this team is 100% happy with everything on their roster. They're not going to sign new players. I think every team's going to sign new players, and they're going to get rid of players, so they're going to try to retool their roster to make it better than it already is. But I think you have to look at some of these teams and some of the players on some of these teams and just go, maybe we're in a good position. A great example is the Florida Mayhem, right? The Florida Mayhem finished the season with 6 wins. They were the worst team in the league. But when you look at the way this roster is built right now, it's a pretty solid roster. I've kind of, in my head, gone through what I think, if you're the Florida Mayhem, what you should do. I don't think the Florida Mayhem are a team that should try to cut their roster down a lot. I think one of the best things this team could do would be to have a 12-man roster, which they currently do. Now, I think there are some players on this roster currently that I don't think they should be keeping. I think there's some players that they can really just get rid of and then maybe bring in some extra players, two new players to help out. But right now, I think you can look at the Florida Mayhem and say, you keep Saya player, or Hagapun, and Chris, and BQB, and Fate, Byram, Rain, DPI, Gargoyle, Correa, and you keep those 10. You get rid of Zephyr, you get rid of Swan, you have a kind of addition of 2 players, and you focus on that, you build around that, you see what you like, see what you don't like, you get into the regular season, you make some changes to see how things are going, and then you cut players and trade players as you feel necessary. But like the Florida Mayhem, I think, are in a very good position going forward. So I don't think they need to be worried necessarily about their future. I think you have a team that really should be happy with where they are right now. And I think going forward, they're a team that will make a couple changes here and there. But I think their season at the end of the day may have been a success because, yes, they struggled, but they have gotten to a point where they have a roster that looks pretty good, and that next season, a roster that could be able to get them into the playoffs based on the way we saw them performing late in the season. You give this team more time to kind of grind and get working, and I think this is a team that we will see have success. I think the same thing you can say about the Washington Justice. They made some changes throughout the season. They have 2 players in Lulcich and Elavote who we have not seen hit the stage yet, but they are still on the roster, and they will still be on the roster. You can get rid of your, maybe you get rid of Hyonu, and maybe Guido or something. Who knows? You get rid of somebody, you get rid of a couple players. You bring in some more players. You kind of build this roster in the way that you kind of have now envisioned it as changing a little bit. And I think you have a season that you could say, yeah, they have a successful looking team going forward. So does that mean you had a successful season? Well, I think you could argue that it does. I think there are definitely teams at the bottom of the roster that weren't successful. The Boston Uprising had a great start to the season, and then they really just kind of fell apart late in the season, and they had one of the worst ends to the season of any team in the league. The Houston Outlaws, I think, did not meet expectations. They definitely fell short. The Toronto Defiant started strong, ended poorly. The Dallas Fuel started strong, ended poorly. I think at the end of the day, how successful your season was comes down to how good your ending was. Did you have a good end to your season? Right? If you at the end of the season were a bad team, well, that doesn't speak a lot of good, because that meant that as the season progressed, other teams were getting better and you were getting worse. And some teams made roster moves that didn't really work out. Like the Toronto Defiant made a lot of roster moves that didn't really work out in the long run. So I think you have to really look at that as kind of the metric, in my opinion, that determines success the most. You can also look at some of these teams that are from the 2018 season. Did they improve? The Shanghai Dragons, yes, they didn't finish in the top 10. They did manage to win a match in the play-in, which I guess in a way makes them finish in the top 10. But they were 0-40 last season. They improved by 13 wins this season. There were less matches to play, and they improved by 13 wins. That's insane. That's ridiculous. That shouldn't happen. But the Shanghai Dragons did it because they had a very bad first season, but this season they were a solid team that looked good. They won Stage 3 playoffs. Like, that's a huge thing to really recognize, that the Shanghai Dragons won the Stage 3 playoffs. They were the team that managed to win the Stage 3 playoffs. Only 6 teams in the Overwatch League have ever won a stage playoff. London, New York, Valiant, Vancouver, San Francisco, and Shanghai. You cannot stress the importance of that. It's so important that they were able to win a stage playoff. And I think that's something you have to kind of look at success as. Teams that are interesting as well to kind of look at, London and Philadelphia. They both made grand finals last year, and neither of them made it to that point this year. So that's a problematic thing too. Like you really set the expectations high based on your season 1 performance, but you didn't meet those expectations. But at the same time, neither team was all that impressive during the regular season last season. They were the 5 and the 6 seed in the 6-team playoff. So they were the bottom 2 in the playoffs, and then they managed to make it all the way to grand finals, which no one really expected. So it's a really crazy thought process here to look at the league and to look at all these teams and just say, like, yeah, every team was a failure that didn't win the grand finals. Because that's not true. I think you have to recognize that there's a lot of success that you can have just based on how you performed throughout the whole season. Yes, New York is a team that everyone had super high expectations for. They're going to win the grand finals. I think you realistically have to look at New York and say, yeah, you know what? Just because we had those expectations for them doesn't mean that they didn't have a successful season. Fan expectations and whatnot are a problem, because you have to kind of, when you go into a season with these expectations and they don't meet those expectations, the problem with that is that you have no way to really know how things are going to be behind the scenes. So you may say New York is going to be the team that wins the whole thing, but that's all subjective, and that's all based on things that you are going into with, but you haven't seen any of what's going on. You haven't seen the expansion teams play against the other teams, and it's a problem to kind of say with absolute certainty, like, this team's going to be the best team or this team's going to be the worst team, is ridiculous. So gauging success is definitely difficult for a lot of these teams in a lot of different ways, because it's all different for the different teams. But I think at the end of the day, you can just kind of run down the list and say, how did they do at the end of the season? I think most teams had a successful season this season. I'd say very few had a not successful season. I think you have to look at the not successful ones as your teams like Boston, Toronto, Houston, Dallas, Paris, who didn't perform well throughout the season, who didn't make the right changes throughout the season and then kind of fell short. You know, maybe Philadelphia and London, teams who didn't make the same run that they did last season. The Valiant, maybe as well, because they had a really strong inaugural season, but they had a really rough start to the 2019 season. But they made a lot of changes throughout the season, and they started improving, and they looked like a strong team at the end of the season. So there's obviously some teams that are hard, especially to determine whether or not they had a successful season. But I think at the end of the day, the metric that I think is most important is going forward. How confident is this team, or how confident can the fans be of these teams in their ability to perform in the 2020 season and beyond? And I think that's the most important thing that gauges success. Is this team good enough to perform going forward? Do they need to make a lot of changes to perform, or can they take the team as they are now, build up the chemistry, build up the play time, and look like a good team going forward? That to me is the most important thing to gauge success. And I think that is the thing that a lot of these teams definitely have to look at and say, we did a good job in that department. So obviously a very subjective thing to talk about, but I just want to give my opinions on it because I've seen a lot of discussion, especially around New York. Is this team a successful team? Had they redeemed themselves for everything they've done in the past and the poor performances they've had in season playoffs and stage playoffs and all this other stuff? And it's a little ridiculous, I think, to kind of, say that a team that had a top 3 record was a not successful team, or I think it would be hard to say they didn't have success. But obviously, you have different expectations for different teams, and at the end of the day, I think it comes down to: is this team in a good spot when the season ended? If so, they succeeded. If not, they failed. That's just my opinion. Now, I'd like to know what you think about all that below. If you disagree with me on my metrics, if you have a team that you think that I said didn't have a successful season that you think did, or a team that I said did that you think didn't, I'd love to hear that down below. Obviously, it's tough, I think, for a lot of these teams to put them into a category of did or didn't. It's very black and white, when in a lot of cases, maybe they didn't have a not successful season. Maybe they didn't really succeed. They were just kind of somewhere lost in the middle. I'd love to hear your opinions on it, but I'm going to get out of here. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing. I will see you all in the next video, and have a good one.